thanks very much, Russell, and thanks very much for this opportunity to talk to you about where we're at in developing standards. And I welcome this opportunity because we are about to release the first of our standards, which will be on learning outcomes and course design, and I'll talk a little bit more about where we're at in relation to that. I thought I should really give you a little bit of background about the Higher Education Standards Panel so you know where we sit. I hope that I'm not repeating this for people that have heard this before. The panel was established by the TEXA Act. So it spells out as a higher education standards framework, and it talks about a panel. We are, however, quite independent of TEXA. We are not the TEXA Standards Panel. We are an independent panel that makes recommendations to the Minister, and the Minister either accepts or rejects our recommendations. We are required to consult with TEXA, which we do. A member, one of the commissioners attends our meetings, and we're required to consult with the sector, which includes the private higher education providers as well as the universities. And I think we sometimes forget that. We all know the 40 universities, but there are 129 private providers providing higher education to 57,000 students. We were given an existing standards framework which is spelled out in the Act. That consists of threshold standards. Threshold in this context means regulated by TEXA. Got to be very careful, people use words very loosely. Threshold standards were category provider, accreditation, registration and qualification. As well as the threshold standards, there were non-threshold standards which are not regulated, well, were not to be regulated by TEXA, which included teaching and learning, research, information and other. Now we think this framework is flawed because in fact, if you go to the existing threshold standards, you can find a great deal about teaching. And you don't find very much about research. Research is not really covered by only in the category providers where institutions are differentiated on the basis of whether or not they've got research activity. There is relatively little about learning outcomes in the existing threshold standards. Because of the way in which they've been established, there is an enormous amount of duplication. So, in a way, you could argue that if you satisfy the category provider standards, you should satisfy the registration standards, but you don't, and you're required to answer a lot of the questions in several places in the threshold standards. We broke down the threshold standards, we looked at the existing threshold standards, and we could see what coverage there was of each of the topics that there needs to be covered. But we thought it was really quite amazing that the higher education, the core higher education functions weren't part of the regulation. So teaching and learning and research. So our approach is a bit different. We have mapped out what we think are the characteristics of a reasonable provider. All of the characteristics, and we will only have one set of standards. We don't think the category providers' standards are really standards. They're actually a policy decision by government that you will reserve the title university for institutions who have research in 3 fields of study. That's not really a standard in our view. And that will, in our new framework, that will sit to one side, and universities will have a set of standards, higher education providers will have a set of standards, and these standards will not be exactly the same, because we don't expect higher education providers to do research, whereas we do expect universities to do research. But that, again, I stress, is a decision, it's a political decision. So we're currently mapping what are all of the characteristics. So we've got the higher education functions, we've got aspects of management and governance, we've got aspects of student support, and this is all covered in a communique that you can look at the website. But I just wanted to stress that this is an overall framework in which we aim to describe all of the characteristics that you would expect of a higher education provider. Let me say just a couple of words about standards. People confuse standards with learning outcomes. People say standards are falling in Australian university graduates. I've been saying that for as long as I've been involved in universities. I've been saying that forever. That is one use of the word standards. Standards in the terms of the higher education standards framework relates to what would we expect a reasonable provider to have in place in relation to the activities of the university. The second word is threshold. In the existing Act, threshold means regulated by the TEXA or not regulated by TEXA. In our view, threshold, all our standards are threshold standards. You either meet the standard or you don't meet the standard. So we're using threshold in a slightly different sense. We're in fact not using threshold, we're banishing it from our standards as much as we can as we go along, because we think that there is confusion about the way in which it's used. So let me talk now about the two standards that we're about to release. The first one is on course design, and there are 7 standards. We have a view that every standard we have has got to be either measurable or demonstrable. So we're trying to get away from some of the vague words, so measurable or demonstrable. So the first standards for course design says the provider utilises defined processes for designing and assuring the quality of the design of each course of study and the qualifications to which it leads. Processes for course design are approved and overseen by the provider's peak academic governing body. Course design encompasses the rationale for the course of study, course structure, modes of delivery, learning outcomes, methods of assessment, entry requirements and pathways, program student load, articulation arrangements, exit pathways, pathways to further study, and any compulsory requirements for completion, and that these features of all courses of study are documented and publicly accessible in a current version. And then we say something which is the nature and scope of the course and the expectations for student learning are consistent with the qualification to be awarded and informed by the Australian Qualifications Framework. I'm not going to read out the rest, there are another 3, I just wanted to give you a flavour of what we're saying. And then we get to reference points. Now, and I'll say something about what we mean by a reference point in a minute. So the reference point for course design is the Australian Qualifications Framework, January 2013. So we're specifying a particular document. We don't think that you can have standards which are set by another body. So the Australian Qualifications Framework Council changes their framework. We won't automatically accept that change. We would need to examine that to make certain that those changes. Just like for research, it's been suggested that the code of ethics be a standard. Well, we say no, make it a reference point and make it a particular version of the document, not The second reference point for course design is the requirements for professional accreditation of the course of study and registration of graduates where applicable. Now, for both course design and learning outcomes, and I'll say quite a bit more about learning outcomes, we think that the only real way you can assess whether an institution meets these criteria, meets these standards, is by peer review. So you think it's not really possible to define in a set of words to the point that you can get over better than you can get over with a peer review. And there are, you will be aware of a couple of studies that are going on at this time. The Qualification Verification Scheme, which the group of 8 universities has been running, and the Kerry-Lee-Krause project run out of the University of Western Sydney, where, to my satisfaction, they are demonstrating that there's a fair bit of agreement in standards, and I know that the accounting people, I talked to Phil Hancock, is running a similar exercise, and that you can in fact get to an agreement about learning outcome standards or what should be in a course by the use of peers. Let me say, the learning outcomes are where we say the learning outcomes to be achieved on completion of the course of study are specified for each course of study. The learning outcomes for each course of study are consistent with the qualification awarded, are comparable with those for courses of study that lead to the same or similar qualification in Australia, and are informed by international comparators. We then say that the learning outcomes for each course of study: mastery of content, generic skills, the application of generic skills and attributes in the context of the field of study, the requirements of employment required in the field of study. And we go down learning outcomes for each course of study, and the methods of assessment of those outcomes are informed by periodic reviews at least every 5 years, which take account of external reference points that are relevant to the course of study. And when we get to the reference points for learning outcomes, we've got the Australian Qualifications Framework, learning outcome statements developed for the field of study by the Office for Learning and Teaching Discipline Communities or other disciplinary or professional bodies, so we're quite specific. And thirdly, the requirements for professional accreditation of the course of study and registration of graduates where applicable. Now, I want to just say how we define reference points. So we've got 3 reference points so far for learning outcomes. We have 2 reference points for course design. And we say the panel notes that the concept of reference points was broadly supported in feedback to an earlier discussion paper. So what we say that reference points are currently defined as significant codes of frameworks that the Higher Education Standards Panel judges to be of relevance to providers in considering how they achieve and demonstrate compliance with required standards. Reference points are not in themselves higher education standards. Generally, the items listed as reference points are developed and maintained by peak national bodies and agencies. The Higher Education Standards Panel does not create or maintain the items listed as reference points. Now, I hope that makes it very clear to you exactly how the panel is envisaging the development of these, what we are calling learning outcome statements, that we think are very valuable. I think they're particularly valuable at the level that they've been developed. I have some concern that if we go too far down in each discipline, we will become too prescriptive, and we will be inhibiting the diversity of offerings which I think are valuable in a university system. You know, when I have to say, as a Vice-Chancellor, I was always very worried when someone said I can't possibly teach this course in 60 lectures because I won't be able to get through all I need to teach in that amount of time. It always worried me that the content had taken over rather than the approach. So I hope that I've made it very clear, and I'm happy now to answer any questions that you might have in relation to what I've said about reference points, learning outcomes, standards, any other aspect. And on Monday I'm going to talk to the Qualifications Framework Council, and after that we will be releasing the two standards that we've developed. Now we're releasing them for people to comment on so that we can see whether we're heading in the right direction. We're not, we don't believe, we put a lot of work into them, but they may be right off target. And they have got to be seen as part of an overall framework which is different from the existing framework. So I'm happy to answer any questions.